Now, you were expecting Star Wars. I heard last week that Pete said some of you are just getting sick and tired of that Star Wars song. So, I thought I'd change it up a little bit. Now, it's a little bit of a nautical theme. Do any of you recognize that song? There's a few, right? Gilligan's Island. Now, I know that goes way back. In fact, it goes back before my time, but it was this sitcom that came out kind of in the mid-'60s, right? And it was this I guess these two guys took out a bunch of people that was supposed to be on, remember, a 3-hour tour. And, it was anything but a 3-hour tour, and they spent the next 2 or 3 seasons in this sitcom trying to get off the island. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Mostly nothing, but what it does have to do is that we're looking at Acts 27 today, and it's about Paul going on anything but a 3-hour tour, and we're going to find out that, they spend 2 weeks of real nastiness before they get shipwrecked, okay? So I thought I'd just kind of change up the song. Now, if you don't sure actually what the song is, that's okay. And if you don't know who I am, that's okay too. I'm Tim, and I'm actually the Kitchener campus pastor at Creekside. So I'm really happy to be up here hanging out with you guys today. And Kitchener campus, great to have you hanging out down there today with Chris and all the crew. And if you're online today, thank you so much for tuning in and joining us here today. Well, I wanted to start off by asking all of you, I wanted to ask, have you ever been in the midst of a crazy storm? Have you ever been have you ever been in a boat when you're going through, and you're out there and you're in a crazy storm? I mean, it can be nuts. Right now, most of us probably haven't been. For some of us who have been, it was probably a pretty scary experience. I mean, the weather can turn bad pretty quickly when you're in a boat on the lake, let alone in the ocean or in the sea or something like that, right? But I think probably all of us, even if we haven't been in the midst of a storm on a boat, we've been in a storm. We've been in a storm in our lives. There's situations, there's circumstances or things in our lives that have been presented to us that we go through, and man, it's a storm. It's intense, right? I mean, it feels like the waves are so high, so to speak. You're getting jolted. You're getting smacked around. It's a scary thing. You feel stuck. You feel out of control. We have situations. We have circumstances in our lives, maybe even seasons in our lives when we're stuck and we're going through this. It can be life-altering. It can even be life-threatening, right? It can certainly be life-threatening. And here's what I know is it can always be complicated. That's sort of the storms that we tend to go through in life. Now, maybe some of you here today are going through that right now. If you're not, you have gone through something. If you haven't gone through something, I guarantee you will go through something. That's just kind of the mix. That's just kind of what life brings to us at times. And sometimes it brings it to us. Sometimes we just fall right into the storm. Other times we actually walk into the storm because of our own doing, right? Maybe our mistakes or the choices we make. Either way, we deal with storms in our lives. In fact, I know a guy who struggled for years with the storm of anxiety in his life. I mean, he struggled in this storm, and it kept getting worse and worse and worse over the years. In fact, it just got to the point where he was just constantly thinking irrationally. Constantly thinking irrationally about things. And what happens when you begin to think irrationally and you consistently think irrationally? You know what happens? Your actions become irrational, don't they? I mean, he got to a point. Now, understand that it manifested so much in this idea of him being so concerned and worried about sickness, mainly his own family being sick, his kids getting sick. And it manifested itself in that way. And it came to a point where it's becoming so rational that he would take Lysol wipes and he would wipe down his home like every day. He would go into the cars, into his cars in the garage, and he would wipe those down constantly. He was wiping all the touch surfaces, and he was doing this all the time. He would not let his children go to their friend's house. Why would I let you go to your friend's house when there's a chance that they might be coming down with some sickness, right? There's no way. And of course, you're not gonna go over there, and those friends aren't gonna come over here. You had certain points of the year where he didn't wanna visit anybody. He didn't wanna go out for Christmas with his family, his extended family, because he didn't know whether or not someone was gonna be sick. That's the kind of roller coaster of a storm that he was going down. It got to the point where he would try to take control so much of every circumstance. The more control that he would try to take, the more out of control he would become. I mean, that's a storm, right? That's something to go through, and that's intense. Now, you might be saying, well, yeah, that's kind of nutty and crazy or whatever, and however that works. But let me tell you, I've gone through this storm, absolutely. The storm that you maybe have gone through or are going through may be a lot more intense and a lot more complicated and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. Now, maybe for many of us, you're saying, man, I'm so glad that I haven't experienced something like that. For sure, I would never want to go through that. Absolutely. You see, here's the deal. Whether it's something really intense or not so much, whether it's something that's sort of just, season, it's for a season, or it's something that's continued for such a long time, or it's maybe a circumstantial thing. Here's the thing, they're all legit, okay? They're all legit, and we all go through these kinds of storms. We all go through these types of storms. So let me talk to you about a storm for a few minutes that Paul and actually Luke as well, and you'll find in Acts 27 that Luke actually records. It's sort of like he was there on the scene. He's with Paul, and it's like his diary. It's like he's sharing his diary, okay? Like kind of like bit by bit with what's going on, and he's sharing about Paul in particular. It's actually a very cool bit of a narrative right here that we see in Acts 27. So let me kind of get us caught up here. It has been quite a few years for Paul, okay? So Paul, he's around and he's in Jerusalem, and he's really spent the last few years. It's supposed to be a missionary journey, but truthfully, it ends up kind of being like a legal journey, because he finds himself constantly having to defend himself and having to defend the way. Now, he finally wins permission to be able to go stand trial before Caesar back in his homeland. So he, Luke, and a bunch of other prisoners are escorted by a Roman centurion named Julius. And they're about to board a ship and head out from Caesarea. Actually, let me just pull up a map for you, okay? So from Caesarea, you see down in the bottom right-hand corner, and they're about to head out. So they do head out, and I want you to understand that when they head out, this was not a very good time to head out, because it was about mid-October. See, over there, and especially in the Mediterranean Sea and that sort of thing, here's what you would find. You would find that was not a good time of year. October, dangerous time to be in the water. November, deadly time. And this was about mid-October at that point. So they were taking quite a risk by going at this point. However, they set sail from Caesarea, and quickly, and through the wind and stuff, they get to Sidon. They get there, and it's actually kind of interesting. It says that Paul was able to get off the boat, and he was able to go see a few friends and attend to some personal needs, which is actually quite an incredible thing. Here's the thing with the centurion Julius, okay? This Roman soldier, this Roman centurion, this Roman kind of army leader, if you will, this guy must have had an incredible amount of trust and respect for Paul to do that, because as a Roman soldier, if you have someone imprisoned and you have a prisoner and they are in your care, if you lose them, okay, and they AWOL and they take off somewhere, you will pay for it with your life. So he obviously had some sort of favor. Paul obviously had some sort of favor there. Paul goes and he tends to personal needs. He comes back, just as Julius thought. He comes back, and then they board a vessel, and they head, you kind of see it right here, right? They head all the way up here to Myra. But that journey, that's an intense journey. That's a journey where the winds were really picking up. And if you've ever been on a boat before, and you know the winds are kind of nutty, they're kind of crazy, you know that the water's also pretty choppy too, right? It was quite an adventure for them just to go from there to Myra, okay? They get there, and they got there, and they lost a lot of time getting there too. And that was important because remember the timing, remember the season. They wanted to do this as quick as possible because it was just getting worse and worse and worse. They get there, and Paul says, now remember, Paul's a prisoner, but he's got favor with Julius, and he says, Julius, like, you gotta understand here, if we keep sailing, if we keep going, we're like, you're gonna lose all the cargo. You're gonna lose everything you have. And we're gonna lose our lives as well. Well, Julius kind of takes that into account. But he, the ship owner, and the captain of the ship, well, they decide, listen, let's just go a little further on our journey, okay? A little further on our journey. Actually, let me back up. I got ahead of you. On Myra, what they did is they saw an Egyptian ship, a huge vessel that was going to Italy. They boarded that, and then they had the brutal trip to get to Fair Havens. They decide, let's go a little further, but they didn't decide they were gonna go to Italy. They said, if we could just get to Phoenix, we just go to Phoenix, we can port there for the winter, we'll be okay. Paul's like, no, guys, I'm telling you, we're done here. They're gonna go to Phoenix. They head out to Phoenix, and almost immediately, the weather turns for the worst. In fact, scripture says that they hit something called a northeaster. Okay? A northeaster, and here's what that was. A northeaster was like a storm of a wind that was like, it was like typhoon category. It was like hurricane category. And it absolutely hammered them. It hit them so hard. In fact, it hit them so hard that it says that they left the ship to kind of go with where the weather was going to take them. They had no control. And in fact, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. In fact, it got so bad that they just began to throw things out, right? They began to throw cargo out. They began to throw other things out. It got so bad. In fact, it got so bad, the storm raged for many days. It wasn't just a one-day thing. It raged for many days, blotting out the sun and stars. That's important because that was their navigational system. How many of you got Google Maps? They didn't have Google Maps back then, right? Okay? Blotting out the sun and stars until at last all hope was gone. Could you imagine, right? And really, you could. If you're hit and you're in this big wooden boat and you're in like hurricane force winds, all hope was gone after several days. You can just imagine the shape and the condition that these guys were in. Well, at this point, Paul the prisoner, okay, the prisoner Paul, this is just kind of Paul and the way he is, bold Paul. Here's what he does. He steps up and he says, listen, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves from this damage and loss. I don't know if that's like arrogant Paul or whatever. I think there's some debate there. Probably not the best approach if you're talking to someone to say, I told you so, but let's move on, right? But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship's gonna be destroyed. Now, one of you will be lost, but the ship you're on, it's gonna get pummeled and destroyed. Last night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and to whom I serve, stood beside me, and he said this. He said, don't be afraid, Paul. So interesting, right? We see Paul as like some big, I think Paul was afraid. I mean, the angel said, well, don't be afraid, right? You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. That's 276 people on board this ship total, including Paul. So keep up your courage, he says to the guys. Keep up your courage, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me it would. Nevertheless, we're gonna get shipwrecked. Right? We're gonna go aground in some island, and we're gonna get shipwrecked. So he says all that, and scripture goes on to say that at about midnight on the 14th night of this all happening, the 14th night, for some reason, some of the sailors kind of sense maybe getting somewhere. They're getting closer to a shore. So they take a weighted rope and they measure how deep it is, 120 feet. They do it a little bit later. Now they're 90 feet deep. Oh, that sounds great. I mean, they're finally getting to shore. Maybe this will be over. Well, here's the issue with that. It's at midnight. It's pitch black. Now, there was no lighthouses. They didn't have navigation, right? Just think of how primitive it was in that respect. They were in pitch black dark. So maybe they were getting closer to the shore, but the huge fear was that they're going to hit the rocks on the side of the coast. And they're pitch black. So what ends up happening? One of the sailors, actually a few of the sailors, they think, I'm not going through that. I've gone through enough. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to jump in the lifeboat and I'm going to go down and we're going to pretend that maybe we're weighting the boat down or something to help it stop. But, they were throwing out anchors and stuff. But you know what we'll do? We'll escape. We'll get out of here. These guys can deal with it. They can go shipwreck. I'm getting in the boat and I'm going to shore. Well, guess who catches them in the act? Yeah, the prisoner Paul. However he caught them, he catches them in the act. He says to the soldiers, he says, guys, you need to catch these sailors. They can't be doing that because here's the deal. If they go and they do that, we're all gonna die here. They can't do it. So the soldiers are like, I guess we're gonna listen to this guy because this guy seems to have some credibility. He seems to know what he's talking about. They go and they stop the sailors, they get them out of the boat, and they cut the ropes from the sailboat, and the sailboat drifts away. They don't even have a sailboat. They just have their ship, and they're continuing to be battered. Well, Paul, the prisoner Paul, steps up, and he says this on the 14th night of this. He says, guys, you've been so worried. He's talking to the whole ship. You've been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks, okay? Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your heads will perish. You're gonna be okay, he says. You're gonna be okay. So you can imagine the shape and condition these guys are in after 14 nights. Amazingly, they eat. They feel a little better. They actually feel encouraged. And you know what they end up doing? They end up throwing the rest of the grain. They had a lot of grain on there. This Egyptian boat was taking food to Italy. They throw it all out to lighten the load so that they can start sailing through. Dawn is about to approach. They're feeling like maybe there is some hope here. And they run into another issue. See, they're ready to go and they're sailing to shore, but here's the problem. Their ship hits a sandbar. And when their ship hits a sandbar, this ship is literally dead in the water. The waves are smashing it. The waves are hitting it. And the ship is about to break apart. I mean, there's nothing they could do at this point anymore. And of course, what do the soldiers do? They're ready to kill all the prisoners, right? Remember, if a prisoner jumps and goes and he's AWOL and he swims ashore, they have to pay for it with it. So they're ready to kill him. But amazingly, Julius loves Paul at a point where he's about to sacrifice possibly his own safety when he gets back to Italy by telling the rest of the soldiers, don't you touch them. Don't you touch them. He wants to spare Paul and the rest of them. And then what do? They tell the prisoners to jump out of the ship and to swim for shore or grab driftwood or whatever and to get to shore. And all 476 people that were on the boat get to shore and they end up right about here on this dot on this island that we call Malta. And next week, Paul's gonna wrap up the series when he talks about what goes on there with Paul and the rest of them in Malta. But for this week, we find that they went through a tumultuous time. Now, why do I tell you this story? Well, I tell you, first of all, because yes, it's true, it happened. In fact, this was actually a common thing that would happen. Ships would sail, especially back in those days, and they would get shipwrecked. They would go through dangerous weather. This kind of thing happened, but what do we learn from this? What do we take from this? Because we might not be on a boat, and we might not be sailing through hurricane winds on the storm, but we're going through a situation, or we're going through a circumstance, or maybe we're gonna go through it, and we gotta figure, okay, what can help us? How can we go through this? And that's what I want to look at quickly today is I want to pull out 4 things that we see here when we go through storms. We want to remember a couple things. First of all, sailing through life storms is we want to remember to avoid any shortcuts to shore. Any shortcuts to shore. How many of you have ever been stuck in traffic? right? You've been stuck in traffic before. You've been stuck in traffic. I've got a Google Maps. I've got the Waze thing, you know, that Waze app. And I'm on the Waze app, and it's amazing. I'm sitting there, and it's recalculating, and it's telling me all these different, you know, shortcuts and whatever if I'm done in traffic. That's the way it rolls. That's the way it works. We want to get there quickly. And when we're going through a storm and we're going through a situation in life, we want to get through it quickly. We want to take a shortcut. We want to do what it takes to get out of it as soon as we can. That's just kind of human nature for us, right? We want to take control of the scenario. We want to control the narrative, so to speak. And if we're in a spot in a place that we don't like, and man, it's taking control, we want to figure out a way to get through it so we can feel back in control. Now, that's no different for those sailors. Remember we talked about those sailors trying to escape a few minutes ago? You kind of don't blame them, right? It says that the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. Paul says to the soldiers, listen, you're all gonna die, right? We're all gonna die. So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and they let them drift away. Now, sailors are like, no way. There is no way that I'm gonna go through this situation. There is no way that I'm gonna just wait it out, Paul, and the ship's gonna fall apart and I'm gonna swim. There's no way. I'm not going with your narrative. I think I'll go with my own. Paul says, no. You won't go with your own narrative, because here's the deal. We're all gonna suffer and we're all gonna die here if you go with that narrative. You need to understand, Paul's saying, is that there is a process and a path that God has us on here, and we need to follow that process. We need to follow that path. And what we need to remember is that in the storms of life, God has a path that we need to follow. And understand that when there's a path, there's gonna be a process. And with that process, we're gonna need to walk through that process one step at a time. I know we'll be tempted to take the shortcut. I know that we'll be tempted to cheat. Have you ever found that when you try to find the easy way out, it's actually not the easy way out? Have you ever noticed that? That it actually kind of gets a little bit harder, or maybe it's the quick way out of it. Sometimes I've been on a shortcut where I've kind of taken a detour and I'm gonna miss all the traffic. This is fantastic. You know what I find out? It ends up being longer because I actually had to come back to my original point and go on the route that I was supposed to go on. It doesn't get easier. We can't find shortcuts. We can't cheat it. We got to go through the process trusting that the path that God gives us, that's the safest. That's the best path. That's the most productive path for us to be on. So we want to make sure that we avoid any shortcuts to shore. Secondly, well, we want to practice perseverance. We want to practice perseverance, and that's obviously an important point, an important thing. Right now, perseverance, I get it. When we hear that word, it's kind of like, oh man, here we go. When do you use that word? Think about it. When do you use that word? You only ever use that word in the context of when you're trying to tell somebody to not give up because they're about to give up. Right? You only ever hear that word spoken to you in the context of someone telling you, don't give up, because you're ready to give up, which means there's something that you're working through, which means that there's a trial, there's a situation, there's a storm that you're going through. That's when you're using that word. It's a tough situation to go through, but it's really important to persevere and to keep moving and to keep going through it. You never tell a marathon runner to persevere at the first 50 meters, right? You'd always tell them when they're getting cramped at mile 25 or when they just are so exhausted at mile 35. You've got a few more to go. That's the idea of perseverance. It's kind of like if you're in school. Oh, first day is great. You're never hearing the word persevere if you're in school on that first day, but you're hearing it when you're studying for that final exam, and it has been a tumultuous season. Actually, it hasn't been a tumultuous season. What happened is a pandemic hit, and now you got to do things online, and you feel like you're alone, and you feel like you're by yourself. You got to persevere. Or man, I know, I got to persevere. You're hearing it because you know that your kids aren't making the right choices, and they're going down the wrong path, and you're concerned, and you're worried about them, but you're not going to give up, even though you feel like giving up, because it feels like you just keep hitting a wall with them. It's about this idea of perseverance. So you can imagine that the sailors are sick, like literally sick. They're depressed. They're feeling it, and look what happens. Paul says this. He says, I urge you to what? To keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. And then he goes on to say again, keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Hey guys, keep up your courage. Keep up. Now understand, you know what Paul was literally saying there? You know what he was actually saying? He was actually saying this. Keep up your courage actually literally meant, hey guys, cheer up. Cheer up. That's what it was actually going on there. Like, could you imagine? You've been on this boat what seems like forever, and you're going through this and nothing's changing. You feel like you've lost all hope. What's your hope? Your hope is, well, gee, you know what? I hope I die painlessly, right? And he says, cheer up. Like, what, Paul, are you kidding me? Are you sure? Are you deluded? I think you're seasick, Paul. I think you need to have a little bit of food, right? Like, you're telling me, you're telling me to cheer up. You're telling me that this job that I've worked for 35 years, I get the pink slip and they actually escort me out like I'm some animal after 35 years of service. You're telling me to cheer up. It's okay. Right? You're telling me after the diagnosis I just got and after all of this that's happened, you're telling me, okay, listen, no, it's all good, right? Don't worry, be happy. It's like the song, right? That's what you're saying, Paul? Cheer up. No, Paul's not saying cheer up as in, hey, experience this emotion of happiness. Remember happiness, we mistake happiness. Happiness, you know, we think it's happiness is an emotion. It's an emotion for a moment. Right? It gets mixed up with this idea of joy, and he's not talking about, well, just feel happy now. No, he's talking about this idea that he's confident in something. Well, what's he confident in? What's he confident in? You know what he's confident in? He's confident in the fact that he has faith in God to be able to see him through. He has faith in the God that he serves. It's kind of like a mindset, a shift in mindset. It's kind of like a little bit of a shift in thinking. You see, Paul was going to persevere because he had faith. He had faith in God, right? He was taking God at his word, and he had faith in God. He knew and he believed the promise of God. In fact, look what he says, right? He says, for I have what? I have faith in God. Let me ask you a real question. Do you have faith in God? Well, Tim, I wouldn't be sitting in church or watching online this morning if I didn't have faith. No, do you have faith in God? Do you have faith that God knows what you're going through right now because, well, he's omniscient, which means he's all-knowing? Do you have faith that God cares for you in the midst of your storm because that's who God is? God is a caring God. That's part of the character of God. Do you have faith trusting that God's got your back even though it seems so hopeless, you don't understand, it's so confusing, it doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't look like it's good at all? But you have faith in God. If you're a follower of Jesus, you know what? You are a child of God. And if you're a child of God, it's impossible for God to abandon you. Do you have faith in that? See, it's not about just having faith in God as in, yeah, I believe there's a God out there. It's big, large, and in charge, what we call him at Creekside, right? But do you have faith in God in the midst of your situation? Let me read this to you. This is important. I want us to catch this. When we go through the storms, we tend to exercise our faith in the context of looking to eliminate the bad circumstances that we're in. Got to catch that, okay? We tend to exercise our faith in the context of looking to eliminate the bad circumstances we're in. Now, I'm not saying that God isn't a miracle working God. Of course God's a miracle working God. Of course God calms the seas. Of course God heals. I mean, read in scripture, that's exactly what God was doing. But when we take the exception to the rule and we make that the rule, and then God doesn't show up, or God doesn't come through, then it's on God, right? It's God's bad. But here's the deal, right? Having a faith in God isn't just about a pursuit in making sure that we get all the bad taken away and everything's okay. So the better life is, well, I guess the greater my faith is, it must be working out well, right? See, our faith in God, it should produce a sense of perseverance because life is filled with storms. So it's about accepting no matter what's going on, no matter how bad it's getting, no matter how much it doesn't make sense, I have faith in God that somehow, some way, he's got a path through this. Catch this. It's not about having great faith in God. As in, if I can muster up enough great faith in God, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna activate the God button. God's gonna turn on, and God's gonna do all the things. No, it's not about having great faith in God to activate God. It's not about having great faith in God. It's simply about having faith in a great God. Did you catch that? Huge difference. Huge difference. Having faith in a great God who knows what's going on, who knows what's best, and he has you in the midst of the storm, and he is sailing with you. See, we sail through and we persevere because we have faith in who God is and his promises to us. We want to persevere and make sure that God is front and center in all of that. We go thirdly, when we're going through a storm, we want to make sure that we invite God's presence. Well, yeah, that makes sense, right? We want to invite God's presence into the situation. But this is a real practical thing to think about, but a real important thing to think about. Inviting God into the everydayness of the storm that you have going on in your life. I mean, these guys were wrecked, and look what Paul says. He says, you've been so worried. You haven't touched any food. Eat something, okay? You're not going to die. And then what's he do? He gave thanks to God before them. Now, understand, some would say, well, he was doing communion with these guys. Well, understand that the high majority of these guys on the boat, they didn't know Jesus. They were not followers of the way. In fact, it might have just been Paul and Luke. So whether it was communion or whatever it was, look what Paul did. In the midst of the most crazy situation that they're in, he gives thanks to God. In other words, he invites God's presence into the situation. He invites it into. Now, why would he do that? Well, did God leave the situation? Might have felt like that, or did God, was he forgetting what was going on? No, God didn't leave the situation. God hasn't forgotten what's going on. When you invite God's presence in, it's actually a reminder for you and I to know that the power and the presence of God is actually alive and at work in the midst of the storm in our lives. That's why it's so vital and it's so important to invite his presence in. And that's something that we want to focus on doing. So it's inviting his presence. And then finally, we want to remember that our response, okay, your response in the midst of the storm may encourage someone else in their storm. Did you get that right? That our response in the midst of the storm may actually encourage someone in their storm. Look what happens after Paul does all that. He says, everyone was encouraged and began to eat. All 276 of us who were on board. All 276 of us who were on board. Now, I think there's two things going on here. Number one is there's something spiritual going on. Paul invites God into the situation, and these guys don't even know what's going on, but all of a sudden they feel like their spirits are lifted. Yes, physically, because maybe they had some food, of course, but I think there's a spiritual thing going on there. But I also think that there's a relational thing. Think of this progress, right? Paul is a prisoner. He gets on and he's been speaking out this entire time. In fact, he's been building his leadership. We could probably do a message on his leadership just from this whole episode. Paul is gaining influence. Imagine if he just acted like everybody else on the boat. You know where it said finally they just felt like all hope was lost? Imagine if he just left it at that. I'm thinking that we wouldn't be reading this, or if we did, we'd be reading that this was how Paul died. But Paul did not act like everybody else did. Paul had influence. And his influence, in part, came to the result of these guys being encouraged enough to be able to actually eat, to jump off the boat, and to swim to shore, and everybody went to safety. Now, I want to remind you of this. Understand, Paul is not the hero of this story. God's the hero of this story. Any story, okay, God is the hero of this story, but Paul was willingly wanting God to use him and to work through him to be that influence. And here's why I say this. If you're going through a storm and you're going through a situation, yes, you're thinking about yourself. Yes, you're being inundated, absolutely. But understand, when you're going through your storm, other people are watching how you're going through your storm. And some of those people who are watching you as you go through your storm are people who are going through storms themselves. And how you conduct yourself through the storm will have a huge impact on whether or not they see the light of Christ shining through your life in the midst of your storm. See, you could just go through it, or you could look at it and say, what opportunity, God, in the midst of what's going on here, would you give me that I could be an agent of hope in the midst of what I'm going through for someone else going through their own deal and for someone else going through their own storm. Just a huge thing to remember when we're going through. So, let me just conclude saying this. I know someone who's going through that incredible, just a real storm of anxiety, and was going through that for many years. And some of you know that was me. Went through some pretty crazy stuff. And do I still have moments where I kind of hear thunder rumbling in the distance sort of thing? Yeah, I kind of keep my distance though, and it's been a huge work in progress. Here's what I know. What I know is that there were definitely no shortcuts. Some of the situations and things through the storm. I mean, let me tell you, the hope was lost, wanting to give up, all that kind of stuff. There were no shortcuts. Had to go through the process. God had a path. I do know as well that I needed to continue to persevere. And let me tell you, folks, there are times when, through that particular storm in my life, I've gone through a bunch, right? But that particular storm, you didn't feel like persevering. I mean, it's like, yeah, I'm running mile 35 here, and I know it's not a 50-mile race. I don't know how many miles the race is. I just got to keep going, right? I got to keep moving. I got to keep going. And I understood that I can't do this alone, and I needed to surround myself with a community of people, with good, solid people that I could trust. And I also needed some professional help. See, when you go through the storm, sometimes because stuff is complicated, we're gonna need good people to surround us. We're gonna need our life groups to surround us. We're going to need to be involved in good things like maybe Celebrate Recovery and other things like that. But we're also going to need maybe some professional help, maybe some counseling, maybe some medical help. Those things are okay. And we want to invite God's presence into that so that he can lead and guide us through all of that. And I also know through the storm that I had gone through, man, in the midst of it, it sure didn't feel like it sometimes, but I realized that maybe whether it was in the midst of it or after getting through the storm and getting back to shore, I could be an agent of hope for somebody that's right smack dab in the middle. And you might be going through something today and you're right smack dab in the middle. You know what? I want you to know this. Whether you're going through it or you're going through the worst possible thing, God chose to go through the worst possible storm, coming to earth, incarnate, living a perfect life, Jesus, ultimately suffering the worst kind of torture and death, dying on a cross so that you and I in the midst of our storm would not be alone, that we would have God to sail. You see, the God who created the universe is not just some big cosmic powerful God, but he's incredibly personal. And he's not only personal with us, but he completely understands what it's like for us because he himself went through it. And that God who created the universe, that God who saves us for eternity, that God who walks with us through life is the same God who will sail with us through the storm. Maybe he just wants you to hear, hey, it's okay. I'm with you, and I'm sailing through this with you. Would you bow your heads and pray with me? Father, you care about us. We can't begin to comprehend how much you care for us. And I pray that today, whoever's in this room listening, watching, whoever's watching online from wherever, down in Kitchener, Lord, I pray today that you would just speak to hearts and lives. You know the pain and the hurt that people are feeling right now. And I'm asking by your Holy Spirit that you would minister what they need. Grace, maybe it's peace, maybe it's a sense of hope, maybe it's someone to come alongside them, God. Maybe it's just you to somehow wrap your arms around them, so to speak, that they would just know your presence and know your hand, that they're not alone, and no matter what happens, God, they're gonna somehow be okay. So I just pray that, and I pray your blessing and your grace upon us as we go into a new week and whatever storms we're facing and will face. May we know that you've got this and you're walking with us. And I pray this in your all-powerful and caring name. Amen.